On June 22, 1941, Germany launched the largest invasion in military history, 3 million men crossing into Soviet territory along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. But Britain was still fighting. The Royal Navy still controlled the Atlantic. RAF bombers were still striking German cities. For the first time since 1914, Germany was committed to a full-scale war on two fronts. This was not an accident or an emergency response. It was a deliberate strategic choice made with full knowledge of the risks. German leadership understood the dangers of divided forces and split resources. They had studied their own defeat in World War I, where fighting Russia and France simultaneously had led to exhaustion and collapse. Tonight, we examine why Germany made the same mistake again, why it chose to invade the Soviet Union before securing victory in the West, and how that single decision made eventual defeat nearly inevitable. Every military commander learns a fundamental principle: never divide your forces against multiple major enemies if you can avoid it. Concentration of force, bringing overwhelming power to bear at the decisive point, is the foundation of successful warfare. Fighting on multiple fronts violates this principle in the most dangerous way possible. Germany in June 1941 had not defeated Britain. It had not secured the Atlantic. It had not eliminated the threat of British intervention on the continent. And yet it chose to commit the vast majority of its military power to an invasion of the largest country on Earth. This meant fighting two major wars simultaneously with finite resources. The consequences of this choice would determine everything that followed. It meant divided logistics, split production priorities, and forces stretched across thousands of miles with no strategic reserve. Most critically, it meant Germany could not afford to fail in either theater, but also could not commit fully to winning in either one. To understand this decision, you have to understand the political situation in mid-1941. Germany had achieved stunning victories in Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, and France. Only Britain remained undefeated in the West. Hitler had expected Britain to sue for peace after France fell, but instead Churchill had committed to continued resistance. The German leadership faced a choice. They could focus all resources on defeating Britain through invasion, blockade, or strategic bombing. Or they could turn east and deal with what they saw as the inevitable confrontation with the Soviet Union. The latter option meant fighting both simultaneously, but it also meant seizing the initiative rather than waiting. In Berlin, the prevailing view was that Britain was already strategically defeated, unable to invade the continent, incapable of threatening Germany directly. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was seen as a growing threat that needed to be eliminated while German forces held the advantage. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. The decision to fight both Britain and the Soviet Union simultaneously rested on several key assumptions. First, that Britain was effectively neutralized, dangerous but contained. Second, that the Soviet Union would collapse within months under German assault. Third, that the two conflicts could be managed sequentially even if they overlapped chronologically. These assumptions were not random. They were built on Germany's recent experience. France, expected to resist for years, had fallen in 6 weeks. Why should the Soviet Union, perceived as weaker and less organized, take longer? British military power had been demonstrated to be insufficient for continental operations. Why worry about a nation that could barely defend its own islands? The flaw in this reasoning was that it required everything to go according to plan. There was no margin for error. If the Soviet campaign took longer than expected, or if Britain proved more resilient than anticipated, Germany would find itself in exactly the situation its strategic doctrine said to avoid: a protracted multi-front war of attrition. Hitler and the German High Command genuinely believed they could manage both conflicts because they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of both enemies. They saw Britain as a declining imperial power clinging to past glory, lacking the will for serious combat. They viewed the Soviet Union as politically unstable, militarily incompetent, and ripe for collapse under pressure. This was not mere propaganda, it shaped actual operational planning. The invasion of the USSR was designed as a short campaign lasting 3 to 4 months. British military capabilities were dismissed as negligible for offensive operations. The possibility that both assessments might be wrong was not seriously considered. What made these beliefs particularly dangerous was that they were partly correct. Britain did lack the immediate capability to threaten Germany on the continent. The Soviet military was poorly prepared for the initial German assault. But partial accuracy masked complete strategic misjudgment about what these enemies could sustain over time. Not everyone agreed with the decision to open a second front. Senior military professionals, particularly those who remembered World War I, understood the dangers of fighting on multiple fronts. They pointed out that Britain, while unable to invade Germany, could still bomb German cities, threaten supply lines, and tie down significant forces in defense. These officers also noted that the Soviet Union's vast territory meant that even a successful invasion could take far longer than planned. They raised concerns about logistics, supply lines stretching thousands of miles, and the impossibility of maintaining offensive operations in both East and West simultaneously. But by 1941, strategic caution was increasingly unwelcome in German planning circles. The string of victories had created an atmosphere where skepticism was seen as defeatism. Officers who raised concerns were told they lacked vision or were thinking in outdated terms. The decision to invade the Soviet Union proceeded despite professional military reservations about timing and resources. When Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941, Germany committed approximately 75% of its available military power to the Eastern Front. But the remaining 25% in the West was not insignificant. Hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of aircraft, and substantial naval forces were tied down defending against a Britain that was supposedly neutralized and incapable of offensive action. These forces in the West could not be moved to support the Eastern invasion without leaving France, the Low Countries, and Norway vulnerable to British attack. And British attack remained a constant threat. RAF bomber raids continued to strike German targets. The Royal Navy continued to challenge German control of the Atlantic. Small-scale commando raids reminded Germany that the Western Front was still active. From the first day of the Eastern Campaign, Germany was fighting the war its own doctrine said was unwinnable, a true two-front conflict with no strategic reserve and no ability to concentrate forces at the decisive point. The first months of Barbarossa seemed to justify the decision. German forces advanced hundreds of miles, encircled Soviet armies, and captured enormous territories. In Berlin, victory appeared imminent. The Soviet Union seemed to be collapsing exactly as predicted, and Britain remained unable to mount any serious counteroffensive in the West. But the successes masked growing problems. Every mile gained in the East required forces to hold it. Supply lines stretched longer. Equipment broke down. Casualties mounted. And critically, forces that might have been used to finally defeat Britain or secure the Atlantic were instead committed to holding an ever-expanding front in Russia. Britain, meanwhile, was using the time Germany spent in the East to rebuild its forces, expand production, and strengthen its position. Far from being neutralized, British military power was growing while German forces were locked in combat thousands of miles away. The two-front war was already creating the conditions for eventual German defeat, even as tactical victories suggested otherwise. By autumn 1941, the structural problems of the two-front war became undeniable. German aircraft production had to meet demands from both the Eastern Front and defense against RAF bombing in the West. Tank production had to supply both theaters. Fuel, already scarce, had to be divided between forces thousands of miles apart with no efficient way to shift resources based on need. More critically, the campaign in the East was not ending. Soviet resistance continued. The Red Army, though badly mauled, did not collapse. And as autumn turned to winter, German forces found themselves committed to operations far from their supply bases, with no ability to withdraw forces to deal with other threats because every unit was needed to maintain the Eastern Front. Britain, observing this situation, understood that Germany was now strategically overextended. Every German soldier fighting in Russia was a soldier not available to defend against British action. The decision to fight both fronts simultaneously had created opportunities for Germany's enemies that would only grow over time. By December 1941, Germany faced an impossible situation. The Eastern Campaign had not achieved decisive victory, meaning forces could not be withdrawn. But Britain was now joined by the United States, creating an even more dangerous Western threat. The two-front war had escalated into a global conflict that Germany had no realistic plan to win. The logical response would have been to seek a negotiated settlement on one front to concentrate against the other. But Hitler's political position made this impossible. Withdrawal from the East would mean admitting the entire campaign had been a mistake. But continuing to fight both fronts meant accepting a war of attrition that Germany could not win. This is the commitment trap in its clearest form. The decision to fight two fronts simultaneously had created a situation where Germany could not afford to stop fighting either one, but also could not win while fighting both. Every month that passed made the strategic situation worse, but there was no politically acceptable way to change course. The winter of 1941-42 marked the point where the two-front war became irreversible. Soviet counteroffensives forced Germany to commit reserves to prevent collapse in the East. Simultaneously, the entry of the United States meant the Western threat was growing exponentially. Germany was now fighting the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and American industrial might all at once. At this point, concentration of force became impossible. Germany did not have enough troops to defend everywhere it needed to defend. It did not have enough production to supply all active fronts. And it did not have enough resources to build a strategic reserve that could respond to crises. The decision made in June 1941 to fight both Britain and the Soviet Union simultaneously had locked Germany into a strategic position from which there was no escape. Every subsequent decision, every offensive, every defensive operation, every production priority would be constrained by this fundamental overextension. The battlefield consequences of fighting two major fronts simultaneously were devastating. German forces in the East, facing determined Soviet resistance, could not receive the reinforcements they needed because forces had to be maintained in the West. German forces in the West could not be reduced to support Eastern operations because the threat of Allied invasion was real and growing. By 1943, this situation had created a vicious cycle. Every German soldier killed in Russia was one less soldier available to defend against Allied invasion. Every tank sent west to defend France was one less tank available for Eastern operations. Germany was forced to defend everywhere while being strong nowhere, exactly the situation military doctrine said would lead to defeat. The Allies, meanwhile, could choose where and when to apply pressure. They could force Germany to maintain large defensive forces in the West through the threat of invasion, while the Soviets ground down German strength in the East. The two-front war meant Germany was always reacting, never able to mass forces for a decisive blow in either theater. Allied leadership recognized the opportunity that Germany's two-front war created. Churchill and Roosevelt explicitly discussed strategy in terms of keeping maximum pressure on both fronts simultaneously. The goal was not just to defeat Germany, but to prevent it from ever concentrating forces in one place. Soviet leadership, despite enormous losses, understood that every month Germany remained committed in the East was a month Germany could not use to defeat Britain or prepare for American intervention. British leadership recognized that every German division tied down in France was one less division fighting the Soviets. This mutual reinforcement of pressure was exactly what Germany had hoped to avoid. The strategic coordination between allies did not always work perfectly, but the fundamental reality remained: Germany was fighting multiple opponents who could sustain losses longer and replace them faster. The two-front war had created conditions where Allied victory was not certain, but German defeat was increasingly inevitable. The economic consequences of the two-front war were as devastating as the military ones. German industry had to produce equipment suitable for combat in the Russian winter and for defending Western Europe against amphibious invasion. These were completely different requirements that could not be met with the same resources. Aircraft production faced impossible demands: fighters to defend German cities from Allied bombing, ground attack aircraft to support Eastern Front operations, and maritime patrol aircraft to challenge Allied shipping in the Atlantic. Tank production had to balance heavy armor for Eastern combat against lighter, more mobile designs for Western defense. Nothing could be produced in sufficient quantity because everything was needed everywhere. By 1944, German factories were producing less of everything than the Allies were producing of anything. The decision to fight on two fronts had divided Germany's industrial capacity while the Allies could concentrate production to support specific theaters. This mismatch, rooted in strategic overextension, could not be overcome through efficiency or innovation. By 1944, German military and economic leadership privately acknowledged what could not be said publicly: the decision to fight Britain and the Soviet Union simultaneously had made defeat inevitable. Production reports showed impossible shortfalls. Casualty reports showed forces being ground down in both theaters faster than replacements could be trained. Strategic assessments painted a picture of continuous retreat with no possibility of recovery. Some officers began arguing for withdrawal from one front to concentrate against the other. But this was no longer feasible. Soviet forces had grown too strong to simply disengage from. Allied forces in the West were too powerful to leave unchecked. The two-front war had created a strategic trap with no escape. What made this particularly bitter was the recognition that the situation had been predictable. The warnings given in 1941 about the dangers of fighting on two fronts had proven accurate. But by the time this became undeniable, there was no path back. Germany was committed to fighting a war it could not win because of decisions made 3 years earlier. The long-term strategic damage from fighting on two fronts went beyond battlefield losses. Germany's military was not just defeated, it was systematically destroyed through attrition across multiple theaters. Forces that might have been used to mount effective defense in one theater were instead spread thin, defending everywhere. The psychological impact was equally significant. German military leadership lost confidence in strategic planning because every plan had to account for impossible constraints. Soldiers fought knowing that victory on one front would not end the war because other fronts remained active. The population endured bombing from the West while casualty lists arrived from the East. By 1945, Germany's strategic position was beyond recovery. Not because it had lost single battles or campaigns, but because the fundamental decision to fight multiple major enemies simultaneously had created conditions where sustained defense became impossible.
The two-front war had not just weakened Germany, it had eliminated any possibility of achieving strategic objectives.
Historians examining Germany's defeat consistently identify the decision to fight Britain and the Soviet Union simultaneously as one of the critical strategic errors of the war. Some argue it was the decisive mistake that had Germany secured victory in the West first, an Eastern campaign might have succeeded. Others contend that invading the USSR at all was the fundamental error, regardless of timing. What is not in dispute is that fighting both simultaneously violated basic strategic principles and created conditions Germany could not overcome. The military power that might have defeated Britain was committed to Russia. The resources that might have defeated the Soviet Union were tied down defending against Britain and later the United States. The broader lesson is clear: strategic overextension, committing to more than available resources can sustain, leads to defeat regardless of tactical skill or operational competence. Germany's military excellence at the tactical level could not compensate for strategic decisions that made victory impossible. The decision to fight the Soviet Union and Britain simultaneously offers lessons that extend beyond World War II. It demonstrates how strategic decisions made for short-term political reasons can create long-term military disasters. It shows how concentration of force, one of warfare's most fundamental principles, cannot be ignored without consequences. Germany's leadership believed they could manage both conflicts because they misunderstood both enemies. They thought Britain was already defeated and the Soviet Union would collapse quickly. These assumptions were comforting, but they were wrong. And strategic planning based on comforting assumptions rather than realistic assessment leads to failure. For anyone studying strategy, leadership, or decision-making, this stands as one of history's clearest warnings: do not commit to more than you can sustain. Do not fight multiple major enemies simultaneously if you can possibly avoid it. And do not assume your enemies are weaker than they are simply because that assumption makes your preferred strategy seem viable. Germany's decision to fight Britain and the Soviet Union simultaneously was not a single moment of folly. It was the result of accumulated assumptions, political pressures, and strategic misjudgments that seemed reasonable at each step but led to catastrophe when combined. The belief that Britain could be ignored, that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly, and that both conflicts could be managed simultaneously proved fatal. By the time German leadership recognized the error, it was too late to correct. The forces committed to one front could not be withdrawn to support the other without risking immediate disaster. The economic resources divided between theaters could not be suddenly concentrated. And the enemy coalition, recognizing Germany's overextension, coordinated to maintain maximum pressure on both fronts. This is how wars are lost, not necessarily through dramatic battlefield defeats, but through strategic decisions that create impossible situations. Germany entered World War II with significant military advantages. It lost because it chose to fight a type of war those advantages could not win. And history remembers the two-front war as one of the clearest examples of how strategic overreach, no matter how carefully executed tactically, leads inevitably to defeat.